Well, it's time for us to get started, maybe a minute late. We are on the 27th chapter of Leviticus, the very last chapter. The 25th chapter, we talked about the Day of Atonement. 26th chapter was kind of a summary of, in some ways, the entire book, because it's talking about, God says, if you keep my commandments, if you do what I say, if you live the way I want you to, then I'm going to give you all these things. I'm going to bless you in these ways. Then he turns around, and after that, he spends the next bit. It seems a whole lot longer. Well, I guess word-wise, it is a whole lot longer than the blessings. But he says, if you don't, then I'm going to do this. And he said, if you don't listen then, I'm going to keep going. And if you don't listen then, I'm going to keep going. And we mentioned last week that all of the things that he said in those, he actually ended up having to do because the children of Israel did not listen and did not obey him. And that's a lot of what we see throughout the rest of the Old Testament. So chapter 27, the end of chapter 26 stops with, and this is the word of the Lord, I'm paraphrasing, given at Mount Sinai. These are the commandments of God. Well, chapter 27 starts off again, and a lot of people tend to think that, okay, this is kind of an appendix because it ends the same way, but that's not necessarily true. But it's interesting in the fact that the majority, not all, but the majority of all of Leviticus is talking about commandments or things that God wants them to do. Chapter 27 is talking about voluntary stuff. In fact, it's very specific. It's talking about voluntary vows. And when you think of the word vow today, what do you think of? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Wedding. That's, what would you say? Marriage. Yeah, that's the thing that comes to our mind first. But what other kind of vows do we deal with? Military. When you join up in the military, you take a vow. And it's interesting, you know, I got to thinking about this, and you can spread this out a whole lot. Because isn't when we stand up and say the Pledge of Allegiance a type of vow? We do a lot of things like that throughout our lives, but we don't think of them really as vows. And I think that's the problem that we have most of the time when we're looking at Leviticus 27, is we don't think of vows the same way they did. And in context, we don't necessarily think of vows of this type that are in Leviticus. Let's think of let's look at a couple passages before we get started. Turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. It'll give you a few seconds to get there. But we're going to look at a couple of passages that are outside of this context that deal with it, that really do apply a lot to us today. The principles do. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 4 and read verses 4 and 5. And I am currently reading from the English Standard Version. When you vow a vow to God, do not delay in paying it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you vow. It is better that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay. Interesting phraseology in here. Why is someone who vows something to God contrasted with a fool? Well, when you think about who God is the existing one. He's the one that created us. He knows that you've made a vow. He knows that I've made a vow. And if we don't keep it, if we just ignore it, then guess what? We're in essence saying you don't matter. And isn't that the biblical definition of a fool? He who says there is no God. So I think it's interesting how this is phrased here. If you look over in Deuteronomy chapter 23, you get a very similar passage. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 21 through 23. A little bit different flavor, but the same overall meaning. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay in fulfilling it. For the Lord your God shall surely require it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from vowing, you will not be guilty of sin. You shall be careful to do what has passed your lips, for you have voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. So we're seeing the same flavor, the same concept, a little bit different flavoring, with the addition of the idea that if you don't keep your vows to God, it is a sin, and it's actually better if you just don't vow if you're not going to keep it, because if you don't vow, not vowing is not a sin. Yes, ma'am.
You can see how they valued a vow by Jephthah.
That was where we were going next. Thank you for the introduction. Turn over to Genesis. Wait a minute. We're gonna do one more before we get there. Numbers chapter 30 and verse 2. Numbers chapter 30 and verse 2. If a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. And yes, this does show the importance that they took to their word. In today's society, and it has been this way for as long as I can remember, saying something is okay, but if you really want it to mean something, you got to sign it. And a good example of that is, I'm going to take a mortgage out on my house. Yes, I'll pay you back. But that's not good enough. You got to sign it. You see? And so we have, through our actions, taken away from what we say. And I think it's important that as we study Leviticus, we understand a couple of things. One, the vast majority of them were not literate. And so from that standpoint, their word was very, very important. Words are still very, very important. And so from this standpoint, I think we can see vows in a little different light.
I was thinking of the phrase we used to use, my word is my bond.
Yes, we don't really hear that anymore. In case you didn't hear him, he said what the phrase we used to use is, my word is my bond. And go ahead, you're still going. No, okay. And I've forgotten the verse. If you remember it, say it. But let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. Yes, it's the same concept here. Say what you mean what you say, fulfill your vows. And to take it a step further, when we're baptized into Christ, what are we doing? We're pledging our lives to Christ. So okay, so that's kind of a little bit of where we're going. Let's look at a couple of vows from the Old Testament. First, go to Genesis chapter 28.
For the record, that verse was Matthew 5:37.
Thank you very much. For the record, that passage was Matthew 5:37. Genesis chapter 28, starting in verse 20. Now, you may not remember this vow. Then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me, well, let's stop a minute. When was this?
Wasn't it right after he had the dream of the angels going up and down?
That is correct. He has run away from Esau. He's had a dream with the angels going up and down the ladder, a vision from God. And so he wakes up and he says, and then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, And these stones which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. This is, I'm not going to say it's the first, in fact, I'm sure it's not the first example we have of the tenth type of an offering, because Abraham gave a tenth of all he had to Melchizedek. But we see that this was before the old law, before the law at Mount Sinai. So all of this is tying together. And then, of course, in Judges chapter 11, verses 30 and 31, we have the story that Kathy referred to as what we normally call the rash vow of Jephthah. And here was Jephthah had gone out to war, and he made a vow to God. And verse 30, and Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. We're going to get to this passage in reference a little bit later, but once again, here is a vow that we call it a rash vow because we all realize it's probably something he shouldn't have done. And so we see the importance of the words of a vow made, to the extent that we see that our words are our vows. One other vow that two others I'd like to point out before we move forward. 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 11. 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 11. You probably remember this, but you may not remember it as a vow. This is Hannah when she had gone to the temple. And she was praying to God. And as she vowed a vow, she said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to you your servant a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. Now, we can go a lot of different ways from that verse, because there's a lot of little tendrils that go out, the razor or the Nazirite vow, lots of different things. But I want to point out a couple of things here. Samuel was of the line of Levi. So the fact that he was a Levite meant that he could serve in the temple. So that's one thing there. And we see that in 1 Chronicles chapter 6. We see that lineage there. So one last verse, Mark chapter 7. And I want to put this in front of you before we start into chapter 27 of Leviticus, because this is where this concept came from. Mark chapter 7, verse 11. This is Jesus rebuking the Pharisees. But you say, if a man tells his father or mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God. Remember the context here? You're supposed to honor your father and mother, and that meant take care of them. And they were saying, well, whatever you would have been given to you has been given to God. That concept came from this chapter in Leviticus. So let's remember that, and I think that will mean that verse will mean a lot more to you, and you will understand it better as we get through the lesson today. Okay, so back to chapter 27 in Leviticus. We're going to read a larger section than normal. We're going to stop a couple of times, but we'll go through these fairly quickly. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, If anyone makes a special vow to the Lord involving the valuations of persons. Now, that's the English Standard Version. Now, we're going to read that phrase in several different versions so that you can get a flavor of what is being said here a little bit better, I think. The King James says, When a man shall make a singular vow, the person shall be for the Lord by thy estimation. ASV says, When a man shall accomplish a vow, the persons shall be for Jehovah by thy estimation. The NIV says, when a man shall accomplish a vow, the person shall be for, no, excuse me, that's the ASV. I managed to get the wrong one and I killed the NIV. Give me just a second to get it back up. Does somebody have the New American Standard already open? I mean, in New International Version. Can you read that verse, please?
If anyone makes a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving the equivalent value, set the value, well, do I continue?
That's fine. That's fine. Read it one more time so everybody has a good chance to hear it.
If anyone makes a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving the equivalent value.
So by giving the equivalent value is the wording there that we were looking at. One of the versions that is used a lot by, I don't want to say Jews, but by Hebrews, and I can't even pronounce the name of it, says, when anyone explicitly vows to the Lord the equivalent for a human being. The LES version says, whoever vows a vow concerning the value of his life to the Lord. Young's literal version says, when a man maketh a wonderful vow, by thy estimation the persons are Jehovah's. Once again, estimation referring to the value. And then a translation into English of the Septuagint says, whoever shall vow a vow as the valuation of his soul for the Lord. So what we're seeing here is somebody making a vow that in essence is dedicating a person to God. That person may be, as in Hannah's instance, her son. It may be themselves. It could be someone that they had power over in their family. They had that ability. For instance, for most people, for most instances, people were considered property. If you were over them, you could do this. And there were restrictions and things that we're going to see in here. But as we think about that, they're being dedicated to the Lord. Okay? Now, obviously, some people could not work in the temple. They weren't Levites. So what we're seeing, at least what I think we're seeing here, is God saying, okay, if you're dedicating somebody to the Lord, then their value needs to go to the Levites, to the Lord. Their value needs to go to the Lord. Now, in this culture, the culture of the Hebrews at this time, they didn't have IT personnel. They didn't have production supervisors. They had people that worked the flocks, that built buildings. It was manual labor. So when you see these valuations, you're going to see a man in his prime, in his strength, is the most valuable. Why? Because he can do the most physical work. And it varies from there. An older man is worth less. All women are worth less. Children are worth less. Does it mean that people are worthless or not valuable? No. It means that the work they could have produced in that environment was worth less, not that the people were worth less. So, keep that in mind as we read through this, because it's real easy to get distracted by that. What this is saying is that, okay, if someone is dedicated to the Lord and they're either redeemed or they can't do the dedication work that they were dedicated to, they need to be redeemed, and this is the cost, this is what it will cost. In other words, if I were to go up and say, Kathy, I'm dedicating you to the Lord, and she can't do that. Let's say she gets sick. I am responsible for that amount. That's kind of the concept here. So let's read this section. I'm going to read it in the ESV. Verse 1 through about 8. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak unto the people of Israel, and say unto them, If anyone makes a special vow to the Lord involving the valuation of persons, then the valuation of a male from 20 years old up to 60 years old shall be 50 shekels of silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary. If a person is female, the valuation shall be 30 shekels. If the person is from 5 years old up to 20 years old, the valuation be for a male 20 shekels, and for a female 10 shekels. If the person is from a month old to 5 years old, the valuation shall be for a male 5 shekels of silver, and for a female the valuation shall be 3 shekels of silver. And if the person is 60 years or old or over, then the valuation for a male shall be 15 shekels, and for a female 10 shekels. And if anyone is too poor to pay the valuation, then he shall be made to stand before the priest, and the priest shall value him, and the priest shall value him according to what the owner can afford. In other words, okay, I'm going to make a dedication of a person to the Lord, and there is a cost associated with it. We can relate to that because when we become Christians, we're dedicating ourselves to the Lord, and there is a cost associated with that we pay throughout our lives. It's not an evaluation of silver or shekels, but there's still a cost. And so as we see these vows, we have to be careful not to try to make a direct correlation to us, because we don't, number one, have a temple, and we have a different society, so the valuation is different. And we also need to be sure we're not taking this as the value of a person, but a value of their output. Starting in verse 9, if the vow is an animal, okay, stop there long enough just to bring into context. That's what Jephthah thought he was doing. He thought he was going to be offering an animal. He was making a vow of an animal. So this is the types of things that they were doing. If the vow is an animal that may be offered as an offering to the Lord, all of that he gives to the Lord is holy. What does the word holy mean? Set aside, separate, sanctified. That's the concept here. In other words, once it's vowed, it's holy. He shall not exchange it or make a substitute for it, good for bad or bad for good. And if he does in fact substitute one animal for another, then both it and the substitute shall be holy. And if it is any unclean animal that may not be offered as an offering to the Lord, then he shall stand the animal before the priest, and the priest shall value it as either good or bad. As the priest values it, so shall it be. But if he wishes to redeem it, he shall add a fifth to the valuation, or 20%. This is the way we would think of it. So here we see somebody makes a vow of an animal to God. Now, there's a section in there where it says, don't exchange good for bad, or bad for good. Now, we can understand somebody saying, well, here's an animal. Oh, that's not the one I meant to give. I meant to give this one. And he says, no, if you make an exchange like that, they're both holy. They're both set aside for God. And most people tend to think that that means not only were they dedicated to God, but that dedication meant, okay, they were no longer used for anything other than God. In other words, you donate an ox to God, you vow an ox to God, you don't plow your field with it anymore. It's set aside. It's special. So, why would anybody then substitute something? That's the first thing that crossed my mind when I read this. Why would somebody vow an animal to God and then substitute? From a selfish point of view, it makes no sense, because if I substitute, they're both dedicated to God. So what would be a good reason for a substitution? Let's say I dedicated an animal to God that was a clean animal. In other words, one that could actually be sacrificed, and then realized it had a defect. I may not want that to be what I offer God. I want the best for God. So I'll substitute. They both go to God, but I'll give what I meant to give. So I think that's the idea behind this. It's both to allow people to do what they wanted to do, but also to keep people from doing what we tend to do a lot, which is be selfish. Oh, I'm going to give to God, but yeah, I'm really only going to give this. Can anybody think of an example of that in the New Testament? How about Ananias and Sapphira? Where they said, hey, we're going to sell our house and here's the whole profit. What was the answer? You didn't lie to man, you lied to God. Why? Because wasn't it theirs when they had it? Wasn't it theirs to do with what they wanted to? A voluntary offering, a voluntary vow. Here, we're giving it to God. But as people, sometimes teams, let's try that again. We sometimes try to do things wrongly. We sometimes think of ourselves rather than God. So I think that's what you're seeing in these passages here is the concept of, okay, you want to give to God. You want to do special things for God. Right? Well, he's done special things for us. He's brought us out of Egypt. He is our God. He's the creator. Okay, do it, but here's some guidelines to do it by. Verse 14. Now, this one kind of struck me funny. When a man dedicates his house as a holy gift to the Lord, the priest shall value it as either good or bad. As the priest values it, so shall it stand. And if the donor wishes to redeem the house, he shall add a fifth to the valuation price, and it shall be his. Okay, I'm going to donate my house to God. I'm going to make a vow. My house is God's. That doesn't make sense to me. Why, they lived in tents when this was given to them. You start thinking, it just doesn't really make sense. But once again, the concept here is they're making a vow to God, and they say, hey, I'm going to dedicate my house to God. God has been so good to me. I'm going to dedicate my house being the building in this instance. Then the priest comes and says, okay, your house is worth this much. God says, that's the value of it. There's no debate. The priest has said that's what it is, good or bad. That's what it is. If you want the house back, you can buy it back. You can redeem it. But you have to add 20%, a fifth. If you don't redeem it, then it is used by the priest, for the priest. Generally, most people tend to think that since this was mentioned as a house and land is mentioned later, that this was a house in a city. And if you remember, in the city, the year of Jubilee, it didn't return to the original owner, and the cities was different from the land. So we'll just mention that there. Any questions before I go on to the next section? Verse 16. If a man dedicates to the Lord part of the land that is his possession, this is what he has inherited, what was given and assigned to him as they came into the children of Israel. That's what that phrase means. Then the valuation shall be in proportion to its seed. An omer of barley seed shall be valued at 50 shekels of silver. If he dedicates his field from the year of Jubilee, the valuation shall stand. But if he dedicates his field after Jubilee, then the priest shall calculate the price according to the years that remain until the year of Jubilee, and a deduction shall be made from the valuation. And he who dedicates the field, and if he who dedicates the field wishes to redeem it, then he shall add a fifth to its valuation price, and it shall remain his. But if he does not wish to redeem the field, or if he has sold the field to another man, it shall not be redeemed anymore. But the field, when it is released in Jubilee, shall be a holy gift to the Lord, like a field that has been devoted. We will come back to the word devoted. The priest shall be in possession of it. If he dedicates to the Lord a field that he has bought, which is not part of his possession, in other words, he's bought a field, it was not part of his inheritance. If he has bought a field, if he if he dedicates to the Lord a field that he has bought, which is not a part of his possession, then the priest shall calculate the amount of the valuation for it up until the year of Jubilee, and the man shall give the valuation on that day as a holy gift to the Lord. In the year of Jubilee, the field shall return to him from whom it was bought, to whom the land belongs as a possession. Every valuation shall be according to the shekel of the sanctuary. 20 gerahs shall make a shekel. Okay, it gets a little complicated in here because of the concept of their inheritance. This is something that we have a hard time associating with. When we think of our inheritance from God, we're thinking of eternal life. Their inheritance here, they went into the promised land. They were assigned a lot, a plot of land. That land was theirs and their descendants forever. So with that, what he's saying, if you dedicate land to God, then it's valued by the seed it takes to plant it. And that's what you owe God. If you want it back, then you have to pay that much plus 20% up until the year of Jubilee, calculated up or down according to the value, to get that land back. If you bought it from somebody else, now gets a little messed up in my head. Okay, if I bought land from Josh, which was his land that he inherited as part of entering into the land of Canaan, it would go back to him in the year of Jubilee because it was his. If I bought it and dedicated it to God, I could redeem it paying the 20%. You can do the math. It doesn't make any difference. The concept is it still goes back to Josh. But I have to go back and read it again because I got confused here. If you go back to verse 19. And if he who dedicates the field wishes to redeem it, then he shall add a fifth to its valuation price, and it shall remain his. But if he does not wish to redeem it, or if he has sold the field to another man, it shall not be redeemed anymore. So here's the concept. I dedicate this land to God. Okay. By doing that, I am making a monetary contribution to God, whether it be the physical land or if I pay for the seed. Okay? And I sell the land to Roger. I'm not allowed to redeem it anymore. At the year of Jubilee, it stays with the priest. Instead of reverting to Roger or me, it stays with God. So there's some interesting little twitches in here that I don't understand why, where, or how. But the point that I think is being made in these is notice that all of these vows, they're not to Josh. They're not. They're to God. And those vows have a value to God. Now, to the children of Israel, it was a monetary value. Let's continue. Verse 26. But the firstborn of animals, which as a firstborn belongs to God, no man may dedicate, whether ox or sheep, it's the Lord's. And if it's an unclean animal, then he shall buy it back at the valuation and add a fifth to it. If it's not redeemed, it shall be sold at the valuation. Okay, start off. Why could they not dedicate a firstborn to God? Firstborn already belongs to God. Absolutely. That's the point he's making here. God, the firstborn's already God's. If they had an animal, a firstborn sheep, let's just stick with a sheep for a minute. Sheep, it's firstborn, has a little lamb. What do they do with that lamb? It's a sacrifice. It belongs to God. They were allowed to redeem some things back. What were they allowed to redeem back? Their son. That's the big one. They were allowed to redeem their firstborn son back. Their firstborn physical. Think about this. People, they understood their firstborn was God's. They were allowed to redeem that back. Here it says they could redeem back the unclean, but they couldn't redeem back the clean. That's interesting when you start trying to line that up with, okay, firstborn of God, Jesus, clean, unclean. We can't redeem Christ back. You can take that all over the place if you want to. But the point here is he's saying, hey, you don't have the right to dedicate a firstborn animal to God. It's already his. It's his whether you vow it to him or not. So it's almost like, okay, gives us a little bit better understanding of these vows because the vows were being made for a purpose. And there was value being given. So, God, if you give me, then I'm going to give you. We can get in all kinds of trouble with that. I highly recommend you stay away from that. However, if you do that, well, don't be slow, don't be slack in paying to God what's his. But here he's specifically saying, don't give me what's mine. What's not God's? Everything in the world is God's. It kind of plays with your head a little bit. But at the same time, understand this is talking about vows. Don't vow to God something that's already his. We already know everything's his. Why are we making a stupid or rash vow? Maybe I should say. What was it Joshua said? For me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's the kind of vow that, you can stand behind. Okay, verse 28. No devoted thing, and notice now he's using the word devoted. That word, the word being translated devoted is, in most cases, I'm not going to say all cases because I don't know that it's always translated. It's the only word translated to devoted. But that word generally means irrevocably. So no devoted thing that a man devotes to the Lord of anything that is his, whether man or beast, or his inherited field, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. No one devoted who is devoted for destruction from mankind shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death. Now, this gets us back to Jephthah. Most people that I have read, the scholars that be or whatever, seem to think that this is a bad interpretation, that Jephthah's response, the concept of putting Jephthah's daughters to death, was a bad take on this verse, or this passage here. When it says, no one devoted who is devoted for destruction from mankind shall be ransomed, that makes sense. The concept of devoted to destruction does not necessarily incorporate killing. And Samuel is a good example of that. Samuel served his entire life until his destruction, until he died. So there's some confusion about this, and I'm not sure I really understand it all. I think you could spend a year just trying to tie every string on this verse out and still not understand it exactly as they did. But I think it's important that we understand that vows are vows. Got a note here. Let me check this note. Okay, yes, sir.
I was going to say, there may be a distinction to be made between someone devoted to destruction, as your translation said, and someone devoted to God.
There are many times, if you have a Bible that references different verses, they will talk about someone devoted to destruction, and one of the examples they will give would be like the city of Jericho was devoted to destruction. So they said, okay, nobody in that city could be redeemed with the exception of Rahab, obviously. But so that's, yes, a concept that is there. I don't know how to take that much further. The important thing I think we need to remember is we need to be careful that we don't put ourselves in that type of position. We should not be putting ourselves in a position where to complete a vow, we must sin. That should be something we should stay away from. This is a good, I'm not going to say example, but the entire chapter is focusing on the fact that vows to God are indeed vows, and your word should not be broken. Okay, verse 30. Every tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. Okay, let's stop there for just a minute. He's saying, first, when a tithe of everything, a tithe of the produce of the land, animals, land, it's God's. They're saying this is the way, that's part of the Old Testament. This is God's. So he's saying every tithe of the land, whether the seed of the land or the fruit of the trees, it's the Lord's. It's holy to the Lord. Okay, you're a farmer. You have some fruit trees. 10% of it goes to the Lord. It's His. You don't have a choice. It's His. That's what he was telling them. If a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, good example of why he might wish to do that, maybe he needs it to plant seed. Maybe that was all that was good, and he needs it back. There may have been reason. He says, there's a way to do that. He says, if a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he shall add a fifth to it. In other words, I'm going to pay more for that first 10%. We can understand that. Every tithe of herds and flocks, every 10th animal of all that pass under the herdsman's staff, some versions say under the rod, and the concept here was as they would go into the, my brain just went down into the pen, forgotten what you call it. They would have a rod they would put down in front of them so they could count them and see, is this a new calf? Is this a new sheep? And then they would let them in. So everyone that went under the rod, the new ones, they're increased, they gave a tenth. And the way they did it was every 10th one, custom has that they had some sticky black stuff on the rod. Every 10th one, they would just whack kind of on the back and mark it, and that was the one that went. So with that understanding, let's look at the rest of it. Every 10th animal of all that pass under the herdsman's staff shall be holy to the Lord. One shall not differentiate between good or bad, neither shall he make substitution for it. And if he does substitute for it, then both it and the substitute shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. So here we see an example. Here is a man with a herd. He's counting his new sheep. Every 10th new one he marks, and those are automatically sent to the temple. They're gods. Oh, well, one of them has a broken leg or a disformed leg. I'm going to send this one instead, but he sends them both because he's not redeeming it. He's just making it right. Okay, the very last verse. These are the commandments that the Lord commanded Moses for the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. Important lesson from today. Our words are important. Vows are vows. Be careful about your vows to God. Maybe we ought to be vowing more to God. Maybe we ought to be making promises to God. But we also ought to be keeping them. I think sometimes we tend to back up and not think of all that God has given us. Not think of the promises he's given us, of the value to our souls. It's worth more than the whole world. Go on. Okay, so that's the lesson for today. Next week, last time you have to put up with me for a while. Next week, we're going to kind of do a little bit of a summary. I want you to think of the things that throughout the last 6 months you have thought of, that have been brought to your attention in this class, that stand out to you. I'll bring a list of a few, and we'll just make some comments there. Secondly, I want you to look at Hebrews chapters 3 and chapter 4. Hebrews chapters 3 and chapter 4. Because I think that's an important concept about rest that ties directly back to Leviticus. Thank you for your attention in your class, not only today, but for the entire class.